judge has given Donald Trump's legal team until 3 p.m. to respond to the Justice Department's motion to unseal the search warrant and property receipt from the Mar-a-Lago search. Overnight, Trump posted on his social media platform that he would not oppose the release of the documents. In fact, he says, quote, he would encourage their immediate release. Now, that's what he says. But remember, he's had the documents since Monday, and he could have released them at any point himself. He still could. He doesn't have to wait till 3 p.m. He could release them right now. Also, remember what he has said in the past about wanting to release his tax returns and ultimately not doing it. So we'll see. We'll see. As of now, his attorney says it doesn't appear they will object to the release.
So Attorney General Merrick Garland says he personally approved the decision to seek a search warrant for Trump's Mar-a-Lago home. And what may be the most extraordinary of all the developments is this new reporting by the Washington Post that says classified documents relating to nuclear weapons were among the items FBI agents sought in a search of former President Trump's Florida residence on Monday, according to people familiar with the investigation. That could turn the concern over these documents up to 11. It's really a game changer when you're talking about what could have been in these papers.
No question about that. Joining us now is former Attorney General Alfredo Gonzalez. He is the Dean of Belmont University College of Law. And Attorney General, that's where I want to start. I want to start with the Washington Post reporting. I'll read from it. Classified documents relating to nuclear weapons. How serious would it be if those documents were at Mar-a-Lago?
Well, it would be extremely serious, and I think it would certainly form a legitimate basis for the Attorney General to approve an unprecedented search of the Florida state of the former president. So obviously, this is information of the highest order that's important to keep classified for the national security of our country, and I think would justify, if true, again, and as I think some of the reporting indicates. These kind of documents may have been searched for, but we don't know whether or not there were any that were found in the possession of former President Trump.
Again, yeah, according to the Washington Post reporting, we don't know why they thought that documents relating to nuclear weapons were there, and we do not know if they took documents related to nuclear weapons. We only know that they sought them. So, in theory, why would the FBI or Justice Department not want them, not want this type of document at Mar-a-Lago?
Well, because as I said, I just said that this is information that is classified at the highest level. It's information that enemies of this country would want to get their hands on, and obviously it's the information that we want to protect to the greatest extent possible. And it's information that is stored in secured locations and government buildings around this country, and you can't have these kind of documents just laying around, in the home of a private individual. And so that's why it's important to have control of these kind of documents.
Merrick Garland yesterday, the current Attorney General of the United States, it's a job that you had. He came out with this statement, and I think it was a surprise to some people, saying that they had filed a motion to release the search warrant. He said Donald Trump could object to it if he wants, but he made that announcement. What did you think of that move from the Attorney General?
Well, I think it was a good move. I think that first of all, I think coming out and saying something was important. It was important to confirm to the American people that he authorized the search. This wasn't a decision made by some underling. I think it was his comments about the integrity of the department. I think those were statements that needed to be said. He needed to show his people in the building that he was for them and would protect their integrity. So I think it was important that also the statement about unsealing the request for unsealing the documents, I think was made based upon his judgment that unsealing the documents would not compromise the integrity of the investigation, and also it provided protection to the former president. You want to protect the rights of individuals in connection with an investigation, and so giving him the ability to object or to approve the release of the information, I think was a wise decision.
So overnight, Donald Trump said that he would encourage the release of these documents. He's had them since Monday, though, and he could have released them at any time. What does it tell you that he hasn't released them until this point?
Oh, I don't. Again, this would be pure speculation in terms of why he hasn't released them. Perhaps he simply had not had an opportunity to think about, all the repercussions of releasing the documents. The cynic, some cynics would say that, well, this gives him not releasing the documents gives him time to lambast the Department of Justice and use the situation for political purposes. But there could be reasons why he decided not to release it. His lawyers may not have had a chance to develop a strategy to make a recommendation to him. So there may have been legitimate reasons why he wouldn't release the information. And at the end of the day, even if the information is released, there may be nothing in there that really harms the former president. On the other hand, there may be stuff there that may arguably harm the former president, but he may make the claim that, well, I think this was planted by the FBI. So we'll have to wait and just see what happens
Yeah,
here.
we will. We very well may see, at 3:04 this afternoon what exactly all the discussion has been about. I do want to ask you before I let you go. A man in Ohio is dead. A man that law enforcement says tried to enter, an armed man tried to enter the FBI field office in Cincinnati. Someone with this man's name or an account on Trump's social media platform in this man's name was posting the type of thing that was suggesting that he thought violence was necessary in the wake of the search at Mar-a-Lago, in other incendiary type things in this account. What concerns does this raise for you?
I have very serious concerns about the violence that exists in this country, the tribalism in our politics. President Donald Trump had an opportunity to speak out against the violence on January 6th. He could have said something. He could have demanded or certainly encouraged people there at the Capitol to leave peacefully. Here is another opportunity for Donald Trump to say something against violence, and I would encourage him to do that. We have too much violence in this country today based upon differences of values, differences of opinion. We need more civility, quite frankly, in our discourse, and we need leadership at the highest level, not only from the former president, but leaders in Congress. We need Republicans speaking out, as well as Democrats, against violence. We may have disagreements, but we can't have violence.
Former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, I do appreciate you joining us again this morning. Be well.
Thanks, John.
Let's bring in our panel now. We have CNN senior legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Elie Honig, CNN correspondent Kara Scannell, and also with us, former federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York and professor at Cardozo School of Law, Jessica Roth, as well as Greg Erie, who was with the FBI for more than 20 years and is currently the vice president of law enforcement and analysis at the Anti-Defamation League. Elie, I do want to start with you. These documents that we may or may not see at 3 p.m. or close to 3 p.m., what might they show? What might they not show?
Okay, so we're not going to learn everything today. I don't think they're going to be dispositive one way or another, where you can look at those documents and say conclusively, aha, Donald Trump was right, aha, DOJ was right. We're not going to see the affidavit. That is the long narrative document that prosecutors put together saying, here's our evidence, here's the probable cause. That will not be coming out. Donald Trump does not have that. The three things that we are going to potentially learn today are this. First of all, how did the FBI and DOJ describe the premises they were going to search within Mar-a-Lago? That could be interesting. How specific are they as to certain rooms, the basement, the safe? Number two, what types of evidence were they looking for, and what types of evidence did they seize? And again, levels of specificity and generality vary quite a bit. I've seen that kind of thing described as just all documents, all laptops, but I've seen it broken down in much more specificity. Number three, and I think most importantly, what potential crimes did prosecutors believe they had probable cause to show were committed? That likely will be in the documents if they come out. I'm going to look right to that, because that'll give us a sense of where are prosecutors on this? What crimes do they think, and did a judge sign off on, may have been committed?